Brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
So we are starting on history of China. I believe this is episode 55. I can't believe we're 55 episodes into this. Before I start, I do have a request of anyone who is watching this and enjoying this. I got in trouble with Facebook the other day because I was distributing the link to various groups, history groups, and apparently they don't let you do more than 5. So if you guys like what we're doing, do me a favor and post a link to this video in your favorite history Facebook group or any other forum you see fit, because that helps with the promotion and that helps us get a bigger audience and get more people educated on interesting random stuff that you sometimes do not find in the Western discourse. Okay. All right. So history of China. More disclaimers. Okay. When I said before that I'm not an expert on the topic, that was nothing. I'm really not an expert on this topic. So you and I are all going to be learning together as we progress, one step at a time. So don't ask me advanced questions because I'm learning as I go. This is a very, very big topic. When I say China, another disclaimer number 2, when I say China in this context, I do not mean the modern state of China. I do not mean the ancient state that we now refer to oftentimes as China. What I mean is the various peoples, nations, and populations, ethnicities and linguistic groups, ways of life and cultures that existed on the territory that is currently occupied by the state we commonly refer to as China. China, so just from now on, when I say the term China, just understand that I'm talking about the map territory. And while we're talking about it, let me show you what that territory is. Now, when you look at China, modern day China, on the map, it looks a lot like a chicken. And oftentimes the Chinese people refer to their territory as the chicken. And I will show you why. As you can see, it is a very large territory. It encompasses a very, very significant region. It is currently the 3rd largest country territory-wise on the planet. First one being Russian Federation, followed by Canada, followed by the China state. And of course, such a large territory cannot be uniform territory. Before we progress with these maps, I just want to share with you guys now as opening quote is one of my favorite quotes in the world, and that's a quote from Mao Zedong. Since we're on a history podcast here, once upon a time, Mao Zedong was approached and he was asked what he thought about the French Revolution. And Mao Zedong responded by saying, well, it's too early to tell. I really like that quote because I think that really shows you the mentality of that civilization. And I am not at all hesitant to call the conglomeration of peoples that we now know as China as a civilization of its own. It is a large territory, like I said. And it is a territory that encompasses a lot of different entities. So we talked about the chicken. Now we're going to talk about population. Now, not only is China the 3rd largest country in the world. You can tell I'm really nervous. I'm kind of like, it's very scary stuff to touch. 3rd disclaimer, people who may be of Chinese origin or Chinese nationals or experts on China, we are going to be approaching this material, unfortunately, mostly from the Western-centric point of view. I am aware that this is not the only existing point of view in the world. I'm aware that the Chinese historians, Chinese peoples in general, have a different approach to history and have a very different view of what the word history means and how it should be approached. And there are vast disagreements between the Western and the Eastern approach to this whole subject. And I mean history, anthropology, archaeology, all of that. I'm going to do my best to include both, but being that I am not myself of the Chinese origin or origin of any other peoples on this territory, I unfortunately am stuck with the Western perspective. So population-wise, now we know that between India and China, we have majority of the world population right now, pretty much right there. There's some questions about the latest estimate of peoples who live on this territory. The last official census was in 2010. There was one scheduled for last year, but then we had COVID happened and that kind of fell through. That estimate is somewhere around, what is it, 1.4. So it's 1.4 billion, but there's a pretty good indication that that number is not correct. The reason why that number is not correct is because, according to some extreme thinkers, that number is severely kind of hyped up. It's severely over the top. And those people claim that the government of China is increasing its population, so it comes off as more politically weighty entity in the territory of the planet. Though I don't see how 0.1 billion more or 0.1 billion less is going to really affect your weightiness when you have this many people. So they estimate that maybe it's as low as, 1 billion. The other kind of end of the spectrum of people claim that they are actually severely underestimating. And the people who are knowledgeable on the subjects, the people whose opinion I trust, and I will list some of these here in a minute, tend to lean on that the number of 1.4 is kind of a little bit under. The extreme figures of the extreme end are as high as 2.7. But there's a good chance that there's a lot of people underestimate, kind of undercounted. And the reason why is because there was a kind of a control of population growth for a long time. And because Chinese society is a very traditional society, and in a lot of especially rural areas, having a boy as the heir to your family, somebody who can inherit your task of your lifetime, having a boy was very important. And so because oftentimes families were limited to just one child, people would oftentimes not report female children, never register them. And there is a huge problem currently in China with the females who are not registered and who don't have official documentation in rural areas, and the government knows nothing about. And when you are a non-existent citizen, because nowadays, if there's no document, right, there's no person, there's a lot of bad things that can happen to these ladies because they are undocumented. However, there's a kind of, on the one hand, it's disadvantageous to females, but on the other hand, it's kind of advantageous to females. Because of this incessant desire to have boys, now the percentage of boys to girls in China is, I think it's 3-1. So there's severe shortage of females. And in most traditional societies, the parents are very worried about how they're going to get their daughters married off, right? Well, in China, that's never a problem because there's lots of candidates to marry their female offspring. So in that sense, China is China is not a homogeneous territory, not a homogeneous population. So as far as how many people, we know that China is very densely populated. Well, this is about how the population density works across the territory. You can see that this region right here is very sparsely populated, of course, by Chinese standards, to where this region right here is extremely thickly populated. And as a matter of fact, 94% of the entire Chinese population resides in this area, to where only 6% resides in the area that's closer to Russian borders, for example. So when Russian panicking public says that, oh no, the Chinese, there's so many of them, they're going to come over our borders, take over our Siberia. Well, by Chinese standards, there's not a lot of population in this particular region of China. Next, ethnicity-wise. Now, we all think when we think of China, we think of the Chinese people, right? Well, wrong. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different groups that live in China. As a matter of fact, the Communist China state recognizes 56 official peoples who live in the state of China. Let me stop sharing and show you the list of these peoples, just so that you have an idea. Now, that's 56 officially recognized minority groups. There's more than that in reality, but these are the ones that they recognize and they're aware of. Han, of course, is the dominant population, majority of, and we will talk about how homogeneous the Han group is. Now, guys, my pronunciation is going to be Russian. I am going to stick to it because I have a strong suspicion that being a neighbor of China's, Russians may have a little bit closer pronunciation to the original Chinese language, not always, but often. Moreover, I know that Chinese language can be quite accurately recorded by Cyrillic alphabet without any distortion, but we will get to that. So the number one group, of course, is the Han group, and that's pretty much dominant group in China. Then after that, we have Zhuang group, and then all these other groups, Uyghurs, we will talk about some of these Uyghurs, which are very much right now on the news front lines, right? And I'm scrolling down. I mean, these are a lot of different groups. We will try to talk about some of them as we move forward. This is an introductory episode, so we're just going to talk about China in general. By the way, somewhere in there, I think there's Russians. Yeah, Russians actually. Also percentage of population. So Uzbek. So there's a lot of different peoples who live in China, a lot of different linguistic groups, there are a lot of different populations. So this is just to give you a very rough idea of population spread, different populations spread across the country. Nowadays, oftentimes the main, I'm going to call them Chinese, though in reality, these are the Han people. Originally, when China was formed, Communist China was formed, it was very much imitating early Soviet Union. So they gave kind of administrative individual units to various minorities. Of course, the larger was the minority, the more independence it was supposed to have. Though unlike the Soviet Union, they did not include in their constitution the ability of these republics, for lack of a better term, or provinces in case of China, to exit like the Soviet Union did, which kind of backfired horribly in 91, 92. But that's neither here nor there. But let's talk about just some of these groups. Again, when we talk about this territory, we are talking about a whole another world. We're talking about the civilization, or rather groups of civilizations, with many different historical processes, with many different, who had their own barbarians, who had their own natives, who had their own aborigine type people, who had their own nomadic groups, who had conflicts and kingdoms within the territory that oftentimes spoke different languages and were drastically different from each other and were at war. So the second largest group currently in China is the Zhuang group. There's 18 million of them estimated as of 2010. They are in the south part of China, and they have many clans, many tribes, and many different issues within themselves. In some way, they remind you of the Native American situation in the United States, though maybe not as drastic, but as complex in the sense that there's different entities, clans, groups, tribal societies that are sometimes to this day conflict with each other. Unfortunately, these days, a lot of these peoples are oftentimes serving as they almost oftentimes work as themselves. In other words, their job is to be their traditional ethnic self, and the mainstream Chinese people travel to these villages and get their ethnographic experience, which, it's questionable whether that's good or bad. I mean, today there's a huge tendency against that sort of quote unquote colonial behavior. But on the other hand, it does preserve some of these traditional songs, some of these traditional practices, for example, summoning of the rain ritual and so on and so forth. But these are the Zhuang people. Now, there are some other interesting groups with their own languages and their own writing system. This is the Miao people's writing group. And this is their writing system. So some of these groups had their own written symbols, their own, not as much alphabets. Oftentimes this was sacred writing rather than, administrative kind of narrative writing that the Chinese writing system eventually became. Here's another group.
You want to see the weird writing system? Check out the Mongolian one that they don't use in Mongolia anymore, or they're going back. It looks like a vertical line with squiggles on it. And I have a friend who lives in Inner Mongolia, in Mongol, and her name is bizarre.
Right. Actually, a good friend of mine in Russia, he reads Mongolian. That's when we get to Mongolia. A lot of my information comes from their actual Mongolian text. Okay, I pulled up the other writing system. It's actually a lot of this information I'm taking from, again, a Russian scientist who is a specialist in China. And he has an amazing series of lectures. Let me make this larger.
What direction do they traditionally write? Is it from right to left and up to down, or how do they do it?
We will get to that when I understand the language system. Like I said, you're learning right alongside me. I'm going to be very honest with you. This is the other writing system, and this is Nasi people, right? Am I pronouncing this right? Yeah, Nasi people. And this is kind of pictographic writing system that is very unique. Again, this is sacred writing. Now, we will talk about the origin of the writing in China. So far, I've gotten as far as the very early hieroglyphs in China and very first writing system in China. Besides that, I know nothing. All I know is that it is fairly complex, and we will talk about what effect that had on people's lives. Okay, then the next large group will be the Uyghur people, which is, we hear about them in the news quite a bit. This is a population that actually was joined, when I say to join, annexed, incorporated, appropriated by China fairly late. Originally there's about 11 million of them. They're Muslim. In the 18th century is when they became a part of China. Then they tried to not be a part of China, but somehow from the Soviet Union for a while. And then they became a part of China again. And now they're still a part of China. And there's a lot of complications going on with these people. I'm not going to go into politics, modern situation. Needless to say, this is a group that joined the Chinese larger state much later on. So our next group that we have is going to be Tibet. And this is some images. Now, again, another highly politicized area. And I'm going to do a whole separate episode on history of Tibet because these people deserve their own individual episode. They're completely different from anything else out there. Now, again, they joined about 18th century. When I say joined, I mean been appropriated. There's a lot of political campaigns around this. I'm not going to offend anyone by going into this. Needless to say, Tibetan people are very unique. Their original place of residence was really high up on the mountain. And even today, when the Chinese government is trying to relocate a lot of the main Chinese population to that area, the problem is that the child death rate for the Chinese, for the Han people, for example, who are repopulated into the Tibet area is 3 times higher than for the native Tibetans, even though the native Tibetans are not getting as good of a healthcare as the Chinese peoples there. So it's kind of, this region is getting assimilated much, much more slowly. Next group is the Mongols. That's Inner Mongolia. Now, of the Mongols, there's 6 million of them in China, and there's 4 million of them living in Mongolia. We're going to have a whole separate series of episodes regarding the Mongols. Needless to say, some of my favorite peoples in the world with a very unique and interesting history. Right now, because their area of residence is so close to central Chinese regions, and there have been so many Han and other Chinese ethnicities moved to that area, that oftentimes when you're in a city that's supposed to be a city of Inner Mongolia, your chances of actually meeting somebody who's Mongolian are pretty close to 0. And if you meet them, you will not know they're Mongolian because they oftentimes don't present themselves that way. And that's what happens when, I'm not criticizing, nor approving, I'm just stating facts as they are. That's what happens to minority groups oftentimes in enormous, enormous countries such as China.
Something interesting about the Mongolians in particular, that part of China, they're very tall. Like 6 foot is normal for the people up there, where the rest of China, they're quite short. So there are some interesting tall people in China. They're mostly Mongolian.
There's diversity, ethnic diversity galore. And we will talk a lot more closely about some of these people. Next peoples that I wanted to talk about are the peoples that pretty much, they technically still exist, but they technically don't. And that's the Manchur people. They were an elite warrior class that the last existing dynasty of China were Manchurian. Manchus, again, I'm using Russian pronunciation, Manchu. And when the rulers from this particular group came and became the rulers of China, they moved a lot of their tribal supporters into central China because they wanted to have their peeps around them, right? So they could feel a little bit more confident on the throne. Well, what happened as a result of several centuries, as these people got so Chinized and assimilated, that today you would be hard pressed to distinguish a Manchurian person from a Chinese person. And the lecturer that I was listening to, I'll mention him here in a minute, said that I think in 2008 he knew of 3 living speakers of the Manchurian language. Considering that of them, most of them were over the age of 80, there's probably none left today. Now, there's another small ethnicity that speaks kind of a variant of the Manchurian language that lives more towards the outskirts, but it's also a fairly small population, and their desire to speak their own language is fading quickly, especially considering the fact that China is trying to kind of unify the country right now. But they were warrior class, and there's actually a book written by a kid from the family of the Manchurian aristocrats, and it's called Under Crimson Banners. Under Crimson Banners, it is a really good book, and it's written about this family that was warrior nobility, and because they were warrior nobility, in more modern age, they didn't want to, like most warrior nobility, they didn't think it was okay to do crafts, be a merchant, to work, and so they pretty much sat around and slowly decayed into nothing, which is unfortunately what happens in the modern society to a lot of people of the traditional warrior culture. Okay, then I'm going to jump to the languages. So now we have the main Han group, right? Which is one group, right? It's a one big uniform group. Wrong. I'm sure a lot of you know that there's several variants of the actual official Chinese language, and that even though the hieroglyphic system is kind of close-ish, maybe-ish, if you get, 200 kilometers outside of Beijing, and you are a speaker of traditional standard government Chinese language, if you attempt to speak it to people there, you're going to have a really hard time getting your message across. And if you get 400 kilometers outside of Beijing, you're going to have no luck getting your message across, and you're going to have to go and find a little kid from nearby school, because currently the government is teaching all the little kids the proper literary Chinese. And the kid may be able to interpret for you what you're trying to say to his or her relatives.
Sounds across London.
Well, yes and no. What we have in London is dialects, and what it's called in China, it's also referred to as dialects. The difference between the dialects, let's say in Russia, on Russian territory, or dialects, in London, which is even less, is that these dialects and anywhere else would be called a language, because the difference is absolutely enormous. Grammatical structure of sentences is different. Forget the phonetics, forget the words, forget the endings. The grammar is different. The order of words is different. These are vastly different.
They're all written the same way, but they sound completely different words and everything.
Right. So the thing that really brings Chinese people together, and that's one thing that the lecturer that I'm kind of going off, because I'm going off a couple of lectures. One of them is actually an ethnic Chinese person who happens to be half Russian, who's, lives in China but speaks Russian. Russia and China traditionally have very, I wouldn't say close relationship, but they study each other very intimately because they're neighbors and they have a lot of, butting heads interests. So traditionally, Chinese people study Soviet Union and then Russia very closely. Well, Russia, then Soviet Union, then Russia, and vice versa. But they say that every Chinese person has layers of patriotism, layers of identity. So there's their rural individual patriotism, like my village is cool, and it goes way beyond what we know in the Western world. To where they can sit there and tell jokes like we tell inappropriate ethnic jokes about, Polish people or, French people. They will be telling the same kind of jokes about the people in the neighboring village, right? Then the next level of identity is their community, like a group of villages or cities, on the level of language, or it's on the level of nationality. And finally, overlapping it all is the identity as I am a Chinese person. And that identity is just as important to them as their local identity. And I think that one of the things that unites these people is really their writing system, because their writing system is what allows always has allowed a person from China, from any part of China, to understand the person from the other part of China. But what's interesting is that the government is actually very much encouraging this little local levels of kind of, I would say, nationalism or patriotism, because it gives people an outlet to where they don't feel like they're all kind of mowed down to the same heights. This is a look, if I remember right, yeah, that's a language map. So this is a map of the languages, and it's a very rough one, I must state, but I mean, you can see how there's many different languages, linguistic groups, some of them different language families, and so on and so. I mean, and we're not talking about the later incomers. We're not talking about completely kind of different linguistic groups like the Korean peoples, some of these other peoples right here. There's just a lot of interesting stuff there, Tibetan people and so on and so forth. This is just a very, very mixed society, very kind of inhomogeneous. And this is another picture of the language groups. Again, this shows you just which particular language groups exist here. So you can see in the Sino-Tibetan group, there's the Mandarin languages, different dialects. There's the Southern, there's the Tibetan, and so on and forth. Then you have the Indo-European, which is the Tajik, Austroasiatic, which is, by the way, the original population of that region was more closely related really to the first people. We're going to talk a little bit more about the anthropology and kind of early people who more closely related to the people who populated Australia and etc. were the original population of this region. And then on top of it came in the people who became the ancestors of, what eventually became the Chinese people. But you can see that there's a lot of Altai language group. There's a lot of different languages in this region. Let's see what else I have to say about languages. Okay, then I want to say just a little bit about the colonies or the former colonies or the various political issues. Again, I'm going to talk about them historically. I'm not going to express any opinion regarding current political situation because it's none of my business, quite frankly, and I'm not an expert on the issue. But historically, there was a Portugal colony in China, and then there was a British colony, and eventually they got handed over to Chinese government fairly recently. The best known of them, of course, is Hong Kong. They're right here. You can see them right here. And they were handed over under the agreement that they were going to have greater liberties and kind of not be subjected to the same rules as everybody else within the country. And mostly the Chinese government has been upholding those promises, those agreements to the best of their ability, though they don't always want to necessarily uphold them. So traditionally, the freedom of press and the general rules applied to what is considered to be normal and acceptable behavior for people in general is a little bit more relaxed in these regions. This is the former Portugal colony. This is the former British colony. Now, Taiwan. Taiwan is in the news a lot lately, and we're not going to talk about the modern political situation around Taiwan because this is a history, podcast. But Taiwan, however, has recently had a very complex and convoluted relationship with mainland China. Now, we can see it's a big island. There's a pretty picture of it. And there's another pretty picture of it. Right. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story to try to help you understand what Taiwan is to China. And I'm going to use Crimea. Again, outside of the modern political situation, we're talking about 1920 and so on and so forth, middle of the Russian Civil War, middle of the Russian Revolution situation. If you know anything about Soviet Union, you know that there used to be an imperial Russia with the Tsar at its head, and then the communists came and they overthrew the Tsar. I'm oversimplifying the story horribly, right? And the Russian military forces broke into two groups, what was referred to as the Red Army, which you all have heard about, the Red October, so on and so forth, which were the communist forces. And then there was what is referred to as White Army. Now, this has nothing to do with people being white, Caucasian. It has to do with the expression of white bone, blue blood, which generally referred to aristocracy back in those days. And the aristocratic forces, we're going to call them for the simplicity's sake, though that's not entirely accurate, monarchist forces, really wanted to preserve the old way of Russian society with the nobility, was kind of, because they themselves kind of overthrew the Tsar before the communists did. But they wanted to kind of preserve the bourgeois kind of society that is closer to Western democracies ish. ish. Some of them, bottom line, it was a conglomeration of former nobility, monarchists, modern revolutionaries of the bourgeois, democratic type.
Military, yeah.
A lot of them were actually top military officers. And so as the Red Army was gradually defeating the White Army forces, we will talk about that in depth when we get to the Russian Civil War. As they were defeating the White Army forces were getting pushed further, and they wound up on the small peninsula of Crimea. And there was such an expression, and still is in Russian historiography, as the island Crimea. And that island Crimea refers to the idea that it was an isolated territory where the old Russia, people were trying to preserve the old Russian Empire on a very small territory, was its own administration, was its own political system, was its own government in exile, and so on and so forth. And it was a great dream of people who were in charge of it, Wrangel in particular, that they would be able to preserve at least a little chunk of what used to be their Russia on this island of Crimea. That failed, and then eventually there was an evacuation. Now, in case of the reason why I'm telling you this story, which has little to do with China, is because it is a very similar situation to what happened in China much later on, when there was the same kind of revolutionary fight. Again, I'm hyper oversimplifying to kindergarten level, between the red forces and what, for lack of a better term, we're going to call an equivalent of white forces. That is, no, they actually, in this case, they were imperialist. And again, it was very similar to the Russian situation, which is why I used it as an example, where there was conglomeration of people who were not, everybody who's not communist, okay? Everybody who does not like communists, does not want to be a communist, is not a part of that left movement. All of these people, so communists called them monarchists, but they were not necessarily monarchists. Am I making sense?
Yeah, they were nationalist Republic.
Hold on.
Yeah, I can understand what you're getting at, I think.
Right. And so this particular, in this particular situation, this concept of island Crimea actually happened in China. So there became two Chinas, because they were able to get and maintain their small territory where they tried to preserve the China they once knew that they failed to preserve on the continent. And there was a leader of this movement, just like in Russian Revolution, there was a leader of that movement. This was, of course, Chiang Kai-shek. And he was the man who was at the helm of this smaller but different and independent second China. For the longest time, Taiwan, go ahead, Chris.
We brought to Chiang Kai-shek in Western countries.
Say that again.
Chiang Kai-shek.
Okay, thank you for saying that the proper way. Again, I'm using a lot of Russianism, and it is what it is. But I'm sure if you know anything about Chinese history, as you look at this portrait, you'll know exactly whom I'm talking about. Anyway, so for a long time, they were able to preserve their status as other China. They, up until very recent, 70-something, I think, they were, they held the place that that should have been, could have been, would have been mainland China's in various international structures like the UN and so on and so forth. And for the longest time, they were recognized. But then there was a motion from the Western countries to incorporate the mainland China into the world politics arena. And suddenly this Taiwanian second China government kind of started getting moved out of these structures. And that's where a lot of the modern conflicts are going on, because if you recognize one China, then you automatically don't recognize the other one. So it's kind of like either or situation. There's the English version of this map. So for all these territories, they actually had their own sub-governments, even though they had no access to these territories. On Taiwan, they had governments, proper governments for these various territories, to where the communist China also had governments of these territories. So when this gentleman passed away, I'm hyper oversimplifying the story. This is a very kind of basic introductory kind of episode. The government in Taiwan started drifting more towards not really reconciliation, but when you're Chinese and you have Chinese people living right there, and it's kind of hard to not recognize them as Chinese people, especially considering everybody else speaks a different type of language entirely and don't use hieroglyphic system that you use. The Chinese government, when I say the Chinese government, I now mean the communist Chinese government, now never recognized the separatist from their point of view region. And they incessantly and repeatedly keep including it in their geography books and everything else as one of their provinces, because originally it was, right? So the situation that was happening up until the very recent, very intense modern events is the integration kind of started happening. On the one hand, a lot of countries they couldn't have an embassy in Taiwan, and Taiwan couldn't have their embassies, but they had kind of sort of pseudo embassies, and kind of an exchange went on anyway. The Taiwan people had their own representation at the Olympic Games and so on and so forth. At the same time, while the Chinese government would go absolutely ballistic on anyone who would officially recognize Taiwan as an independent state and insisted on the one China policy, that Taiwan is a part of China, they, for example, would broadcast Taiwan television channels sometimes on their mainland China television, with very interesting things such as, for example, so it's in Chinese, right? They both speak kind of Chinese, right? So you're watching TV and it says on the TV, the president of Taiwan, right? While in Chinese subtitles, captions for the blind, it says the party representative of the province of Taiwan. To where anybody with half a brain who speaks Chinese can see that those are, am I making sense again? It's kind of overlapping of the concepts. Business was done a lot back and forth between Taiwan and mainland China, scientific conferences, various exchange of literature. There was a lot of integration going on and people traveled back and forth quite easily. What's happening now? I do not know. Frankly, I'd rather not know. Hopefully that situation will not explode into something horrific and bloody. So that's as far as Taiwan goes. 24 million roughly population of Taiwan. Any non-political thoughts, comments, and input?
I prefer not to get into politics, but it's been pretty interesting so far.
Yeah, it's interesting some of the subtle differences. Like in Taiwan, they preserved the old way of writing the Chinese language, and they still do. The Mandarin, I guess. And they also have their own Taiwanese languages there.
Right.
But in China, they simplified it. So you got simplified or traditional Chinese and simple and traditional on Google, for example.
Exact parallel to the Communist Soviet Union and Russia. The exact same thing with the writing system. Yes, by the way, thank you for bringing that up, Chris. Of course, Taiwan had its own original population before all these Chinese immigrants bailed there. I mean, there was already Chinese population on top of the original native population. But then as a result of the Civil War, just like unlike Crimea, because Crimea was already kind of populated by a lot of Russians, but all these people ran from mainland China and wound up there. So kind of dropped on the heads of the people who already lived there to begin with. And because they were anti-communist China, of course, they preserved the old ways and they wanted to preserve the old China, right? The China that they lost. So the last little segment that I want to spend this particular episode on is a discussion of China and history and the role of history in Chinese world. Well, history as a science, and when I say history, I mean archaeology, anthropology, all of that. Western scientists, genetics for that matter, all of that stuff. When the Western scientists refer to, even Russian scientists, which Russia is a lot closer to the East than it is, than the Western countries are, and a lot of ideas. When the Western scientists refer to Chinese publications of any kind, for example, anthropological publications like various prehistoric humans or archaeological sites, or even genetic studies, there's a very dismissive approach from the Western perspective. And the reason for that is because Western science, as of late, has become extremely, well, let me rewind. Up until very recently, as of late, has become extremely logical, very methodical, and very secular. In other words, traditional, up until we got this new wave of flat earthers and so on and so forth, which is more a question of belief, but the mainstream, the staple Western science says cause, effect, prove, show me the facts. You say that Troy was there, show me Troy. It's fact-based. It's very atheistic almost in its approach. It's very, what's the word for it? Secular, but it's very methodical.
It's pragmatic.
Pragmatic thinking. Now, and in Western civilization, I'm going to be talking about Western civilization, of course, and even Eastern civilization in the sense of Middle East. Religion has been a very big part of people's formation. Even today, when Europe is extremely non-religious nowadays, or at least a lot of Europe, that those Christian values, those Christian ideas, those Christian ethics and morals, they're in your bone marrow. Even if you're not a person of European origin, if you rotate in the society that is European fed, you wind up just like, for example, Yahtzee, for example, in society that is native, we all have our baseline worldview imbued into us, right? Faith and ideas and beliefs, rights and wrongs, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I can discern the difference between my way of thinking and the other side, or the modernity world. I can evaluate differences.
So, right, exactly. But even you are probably getting hit by those, even though they're not necessarily originally part of your culture, the Christian ideals. For example, like if you see a naked person walking around, a lot of us go, oh, right? Just automatically, we don't think about it. It's like, oh, what's this person doing naked? Or woman's top drops in the middle of some national show and it's a huge scandal. It's not because we are so horrified by the view of female breasts, it's because there's the idea of, it's imbued in us, it's subconscious, right? And other things like, like the idea that it's good to give to the poor, all kinds of various values that come as a part of culture. I'm using Christianity as a particular example. Go ahead, Yahtzee.
Oh, even how we walk, the way I walk with moccasins is different than walking with modern shoes.
Right.
Little things like that.
Right.
I have to say that I think modern shoes hurt. I don't care for them very much. My feet don't like them. And
4-inch stilettos all the way.
Yeah. Try walking barefoot. It's beautiful.
Thanks, but no thanks. No, I'm just kidding. It depends on where you're walking. But anyway, so I'm using Christianity as a thing. So in Western Europe, the religious paradigm got completely separated at one point in time from the scientific paradigm. And it is very important for the Western people to say this is a religious approach. It's a matter of faith. So there's a clear separation between religion and science. Now, in Chinese history, a couple of things happened. First of all, they definitely have forms of religion, but their religion did not become the domineering culture forming, morality forming, behavior shaping, and society standards, instinctual responses, gut reactions. Their religions, because it's such a diverse and such an inhomogeneous society, one village to another may have very different approach. There's some common themes and things that were important, the movements that were important in Chinese history, things like Taoism, for example, Buddhism, which came there later, and so on and so forth. They're not quite, Buddhism is not really, they're kind of religious-esque, but they're not that in the guts, in your bone marrow, in your subconscious sort of thing. The thing that almost took place of religion throughout Chinese history, all the way back to BC, was history. History of their peoples. Their ancestors are very important in their cultures, but they're differently important in their cultures than they are in a lot of Western cultures. It's not that they just respect their ancestors. It's not that they just live with their ancestors. The past is very definitive to who they are today. So a very important character appeared early on in the Chinese history, and he was a very talented, very enigmatic, and extremely compelling writer. One of the reasons why he was so compelling is because he, on the one hand, was close to the emperor at the time, and on the other hand, towards the end of his life, he had a big falling out with the emperor. He wrote an all-inclusive, very complex, convoluted history of China, and I'm going to say his name here in a second, but because of his falling out towards the end of his life, when you read his histories, unlike, histories, for example, of Herodotus, which in itself are kind of compelling, but he was almost a dissident towards the end of his life. And his works were not actually published during his lifetime. It was his grandson, who managed to find the manuscript in lost in the Imperial Library of all things, where the last place the emperor would look, and published these works. But these works were so intense, they were so compelling. It was like Shakespeare plus Herodotus plus Homer plus you name it. Anybody who sits down and reads this historical account is very much compelled by the strengths of the vision, by the honest kind of presentation, genuine nature of this text. And anyone, even Western person who studies Chinese culture, if they sit down and read these texts, they're so compelled. It is very hard for people to separate actual history of China, as in like the stuff you dug up from the ground, and the stuff that you read in these particular histories. Now, the name of this individual, and I'm going to say it, of course, horribly wrong, because I'm sure it's said differently in English language, but I'm going to show you his, not really portrait as much as, his name in Russian would be Sima Xiang. How, does anybody know how we say that in English? Sima Xiang. Xiang. Yeah. So, and I'm sure that actually in Chinese it's said completely differently. But he was 126 BC. He was 20 years old. He was closely involved with the imperial dynasty at the time. He was close to the emperor. He was an astronomer, a writer, a historian. His famous work known as Shi Si, and it is basically the histories. He finally died. He was born in 135 BC, and he passed away, according to some sources, in 86. His histories, or his notes of a historian, or his historical notes, however you want to translate the title, is what has completely shaped Chinese view of history. And so even a Western reader, Western person who is reading this text is so charmed by it, is so compelled by it. It's hard to separate reality from his stories. Now, if you're a Chinese-born person, you were brought up on these texts, very similarly, but even more so than how the ancient Greeks were brought up on Homer's text, right? To them, that was an absolute reality. Well, to the Chinese people, it's the foundational text of who they are. It is not a question of science. It is not a question of proof. This text, it's the beginning, the end, and nature of Chinese self-comprehension. It's almost like a religion. The thing that really compounded this effect, of course, was the fact that Confucius referred that text in his kind of moral and his behavioral code that was imbued into the Chinese culture very early on. And then, of course, we all know that Chinese culture, unlike the Western culture, was very much a bureaucracy, to where being a bureaucrat was the prestigious thing to be, and the way you made it to the top was by studying vigorously and passing certain exams. Well, a big chunk of those exams were to pass exams on that text and on those concepts. It was a huge part of what it was to be an educated person. Now, because a Chinese person, in order to be educated, because of the complexity of the Chinese writing system, took, at the very least, if you were super talented pupil, maybe 10 years minimum, just to learn how to write properly. Most people, it took 20 and more years to excel. This is something that these are the examples they're using. This is, these are the questions they're having to answer. Furthermore, all of the entertainment, even as far as far villagers who never learned how to read or write, somebody living in far rural nowhere, their only source of entertainment really were either traveling, basically an equivalent of bards, or traveling performers who would show them what stories? Well, they would show them stories based on the histories of that particular text. And so this is a text that literally was your mother's milk, was the very earth, was the very rice, was everything, was every breath you take. It got imbued into the Chinese self-identity, into the Chinese worldview, into the Chinese perception. And so history in China and all the related sciences really is not a science like it is here. It's not like you have mathematics, you have linguistics, you have, whatever, you have history. No, it is worldview. Now, This is why the Chinese approach to the concepts of history is very different from the Western approach. From what I understand, this is based on the gentleman who is a Chinese resident and who lives there. He's a Chinese speaker and native speaker and part of their culture. So the Chinese history textbook starts with, they break up their history into three parts. There's the legendary period, then there's the mythological period, and then there's the historical period. Even modern Chinese historians, even the top-notch geneticists, do not, within their psyche, necessarily make that break between real history and legendary history. Now, they label it as legendary, and they will say things, for example, well, we have not found any actual archaeological evidence of this time period, either legendary or mythological, but we should not dismiss it. And even when they find evidence that is completely contrary to what is written in the histories, they still don't dismiss that possibility, because to them, on a certain plane of existence, both are true. And so their approach to history is, first of all, history takes much more central part. History, anthropology, archaeology, anything that has to do with the past. Traditionally, even as far as BC, the way that noble, respected Chinese person would show their, exquisiteness, educationalness, their understanding of reality, they would collect various ancient texts. Archaeology as a science was not in the modern sense, but in a way was already present very beginning of the century. Such thing as authentication expertise. For example, they had experts who would look at certain ancient, vases, or even things like fortune-telling bones and so on and so forth. They had experts, first century AD, who would actually, through very complex details, like, for example, the slant of the writing, the particular form of hieroglyph, either authenticate very important imperial or other important peoples in the culture collections, and either as authentic or not authentic. So this idea that the past is important, that the past is to be revered, the past is to be collected, on the one hand, is the reason why the continuity of history of Chinese past is so known to us. On the other hand, this endless running around digging things out of the ground has not been very helpful, in a way. So to Chinese people, history is much more sacred subject, and it's much more complex subject than it is to the cut and dry modern Western historians. And the last thing I want to say as far as archaeology in China goes, Chinese peoples, a lot of stuff has been dug up, a lot of stuff has been destroyed. By the same token, there's catalogs that come again from the beginning of first century, second century, third century, etc., BC, AD, catalogs with pictures, drawings of items that may be lost to us today, but we have record of them, right? That's a tradition that goes all the way back in the past. They always kept an eye on that. So even the things that have been lost, there's traces and records of them. But also the modern Chinese archaeology has an approach of, look, we're not going to excavate certain things. Like, for example, the famous burial place of the first Chinese emperor, the Yellow Emperor, has been untouched. The reason why it has... Yeah, the reason, and there's a lot of other sites, very important sites like that they just leave alone. And there's a dual reason for that. First reason for that, and it's a valid reason that even modern Russian archaeologists applaud. They're saying, look, we might not have a way to preserve, because they've had some experiences early on in the communist period when they completely accidentally screwed up very important excavations. So they say, look, we're not going to touch it. We know it's there. We're going to protect it. And sometimes in the future, when the science gets to the point where this can be accurately looked at, let our descendants take a look at this, on the one hand. On the other hand is the fact that what if they dig up something that goes against this traditional mentality and narrative? And I want to make it very clear, this is not the communist Chinese government, okay, that is oppressively putting upon the Chinese people a certain narrative of the past. This is a cultural tradition that way predates any communists in China. It is, again, it's a part of the mindset, of the mentality of Chinese people in general, every Chinese person. And it is something we should treat with a major respect and not as dismissively as Western scientists oftentimes tend to do. Because I think there's something to respecting and understanding that there's a difference between physical reality and the cultural tradition, but that does not invalidate the cultural tradition. They exist in different layers of comprehension. And I think that's where I would like to end today's introductory speech.
It's okay to let sleeping dogs lie.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of things, just briefly. Actually, a whole bunch of. One, I know that you've in previous podcasts, you've expressed your apprehension of delving into Chinese history. And quite honestly, with tonight, I'd say you're totally in your wheelhouse, and you're loving it, and you're doing a beautiful job.
But I'm faking it well.
Yeah, and your approach is both genuine, and it is it's very considered, and it's fantastic.
Traditional Navajo.
You froze up.
Were made up of many different peoples, but
Right.
culturally what defined an old traditional Navajo was learning the language, knowing your creation stories, participating in the ceremonies, and being born or adopted into the Navajo culture. So if you practice those four things, that culturally made you a Navajo, but genetically or technically we're made up of different people. And somehow that book book by that historian, to me at some level seems to be doing that for the Chinese.
Right. And, I'm going to disclose to you guys, I didn't want to do Chinese history because to me, Chinese history is painfully foreign. At a certain point in time, when you get past the warring kingdoms, suddenly it takes a route that in my brain does not click. Everything that we see as Westerners and yes, even Russians are Westerners in the sense as glorious, as romantic, as cool, independent warlords and Vikings and kings and queens and Irish, princes and, all that stuff. Suddenly all that stuff gets in my head, right? This is my very bias, but it gets erased. And suddenly you have to me, again, without having dove into the material as deeply as I have now, has been this kind of dark empire of bureaucrats from hell.
I think there's a way around that. Like the Yellow River, Yangtze, was one of the cradles of civilization at the same time as Mesopotamia. So if you go back that far and forget all the modern stuff, all the more modern creations, looking at how civilization began there in the same ways it began in the Middle East, that's kind of where we should be looking at, I think.
Right, and that's the next one. We're going to do prehistoric peoples and then so on and so forth. But I just want to say that, so having said that I have personally had a real hesitation even touching Chinese history because it kind of weirds me out. Okay, that's just again, I want to say that to what David said, yes, the unification wiped out a lot of peoples, a lot of ethnicities, tradition. Well, so did the Roman Empire. Right? And very similar to Roman Empire, which built Europe as we know today, all the way from America to Russia and everything in between, and then every which direction else, the same way that, this brutal unification process, which was no less and no more brutal, frankly, than the Roman methods, allowed allowed the world to take the shape that it is in right now, for the better or the worse, So that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. Now, guys, we are going to be doing China for a while. Like, prepare to do nothing but China. If you get sick of China, guys, tell me, let's take a break, because even to get up to date to where we are with people of Caucasus, I don't know, like 1st century AD, we're going to be doing, 15, 20 episodes. There's a lot of material there. This is a world that we as Westerners know nothing about, frankly, nothing at all. So we need to start at the beginning and dig in deep. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to see you. And hey, guys, without your support, I could never do it. If you like what we're doing, please like, comment, share us on Facebook, whatever other, media there is. Power to trying to understand history better than we know it now.
That exist within every man's soul. stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.